Before we get started, you're going to want to make sure that Node.js is installed to your system. So navigate to nodejs.org and install it on your system. Once you do that, what you're going to want to do is navigate to MongoDB, and you want to navigate to the Install MongoDB Community Edition. From here, you want to install it based on what you're using. Today, I'm going to be using Windows, so I installed it using these directions. Now you want to go ahead and open Visual Studio Code, and you want to open the folder where you're going to create your project today. And then we want to create a new terminal here, and I'm going to open my command prompt where I'll run all of my commands today, and I can close out of the PowerShell. And instead of using npm to install and manage everything today, we're actually going to use what's called yarn. So to install that, I'm going to use npm I just one time today, -g to globally install this, and I'm going to specify yarn. Go ahead and hit enter and let that install. Now to make sure that installed, I'm going to type out yarn-version, hit enter, and it will show you the version you have installed. This will confirm that yarn is installed. Now we want to go ahead and create a new folder and title this folder Backend, where we're going to put all of our backend code for our database. Then back in our command prompt, we want to cd into our backend directory. And since we installed yarn, we can use it to create a package.json by saying yarn init. And then what we want to do is just hit enter through all of this because we don't want to specify anything specific here, but you guys can if you want. And if we open our backend folder now, you will see our package.json file is created. Now we need to start adding dependencies. So we'll say yarn add express mongoose, and mongoose is going to be specifically for Mongo, body dash parser, cores, and .env. And go ahead and hit enter and let all of those install. And then once that's done, you guys will see that located inside of your package.json under dependencies. Now we're going to add more dependencies using yarn add, but these are going to be specifically for our development environment. So I want to install Babel/core, Babel/node, and then Babel/preset-env. And I also want to install NodeMon and specify that these are dev dependencies by using --dev. Hit enter. Now in our package.json, you can see our dev dependencies and our normal dependencies here. And inside of our package.json, if you don't have it already, what we want to do is create a scripts here, and we want to include a script within this, and we're simply going to title this start. And then when we tell it to start, we want to use NodeMon, use our index.js, which we'll create in a minute, and then we want to execute Babel-node and JavaScript here, and make sure you include your comma. So now back in our command prompt, we're actually going to run this just so I can show you guys how it'll work. So we can say yarn start, but keep in mind we haven't created our index.js or our server yet. So this will not actually do anything and it will just crash. But to get out of this, what we want to do is say Control-C, and that will get us out of the crashed server file here because again, we don't actually have a server yet. Now in our backend, we want to create a new file, and this is going to be .babelrc. And to make Babel work, we just want to simply paste in our presets code here so that it will run correctly. Again, this will be down below in the source code. Next, we want to create another file called .env to store all of our important variables. Then we want to create a .getignore. And in our .getignore, we want to ignore our node modules and our .env file. Now we can navigate to our .env, and we're going to start off by creating our first variable, and we'll call this Mongo_URL. And this will be equal to MongoDB followed by localhost / and here's going to be really important because this is going to be the name of your database. So we're going to call this my products DB here. Then we also want to create one more variable called port, and we're going to be using the port of 4000. Now we're done with our get, ignore, and env files. What we can do is go ahead and create a new file, and we're going to call this index.js. And here is where we're going to set up our server. So we want to start off by importing Express. From Express, import Mongoose. And you guys will see that helps us out in Visual Studio Code. Import our body parser, import cores. You guys will see that it's not going to help me out this time, so I'll do it manually. Next, we want to import .env from .env. And then we want to create a comment here because this is where in a moment we'll import our routes. Next, we want to configure our .env using .env.config. We want to create a variable called app so we can run our Express server. And then we want to create a variable to hold our port. So to grab the variable from our env file here is we want to use process.env.our variable name of port. And this port is coming from our .env right here. And then just in case there's an issue with this, we want to include a default port value of 4000 right here. Next, we want to connect to our Mongo database using mongoose.connect. And then we again want to use process.env, but this time we want to use our Mongo, and this is all capitalized, URL. So again, this is coming directly from our env file here, and this line will create our database called my products database, and you guys can name this whatever you like. This is going to be promise based, so we want to use .then, and we need to pass a function in here with no parameters, and we simply want to say console.log and add the string MongoDB connected successfully. And then if this breaks, we want to include a catch, pass our error, and then we want to log the error to our console. So we'll use console.error, say MongoDB connection error, followed by the error code here. Now we need to configure our middleware, so we'll use our variable app.use, and we need to use our body parser .url encoded, and we need to pass in this an object, say extended, and we want this to be true. Then we need to use app.use again, configure our body parser as JSON, and we need to say app.use one more time, and this time we want to use cores. And below this we're going to add a comment called routes config, because we will come back here in a few minutes to configure our routes. Now, using our app, we're going to use .get, and basically we're going to tell our server what we want it to display for us when we send a GET request to it. And we'll put in a slash to use our root URL, and we want to pass a function with the request and response as the parameters here. And when we get a response, we want to send something, and we want to use backticks here and send our app is running on port, and then we want to use our port variable to display what port we are running our server on when we send a GET request. Underneath GET, we want to use app.listen, and this code will run as soon as we start our server. So we need to pass in our port, create a function, and we simply want to log to our server, and we want to pass in backticks here. Your product server is running on port, and then we want to pass in our port variable one more time. So now if we again open up our command prompt, you guys will see that when we first tried to run it, it said app crashed. But now if we run yarn start again, you guys will see that this successfully runs our server, and you guys can see the messages logging out to our console down below. You can see your product server is running on port 4000, which is coming from our app.listen code, and then MongoDB connected successfully, which is coming from here. Tap here to see what happens next.